Thank you for joining us, Gabe.
Thank you for having me.
I think today, what's the date today? Today is
30th.
October 30th.
October 30th.
Thank you for agreeing to be a part of the Letras Latinas Oral History Project at the Institute for Latino Studies. We'll begin with just some information for posterity and whoever will be viewing this oral history. And I'd like to ask you to state your name, your place of birth, and where you grew up.
My name is Gabe, or Gabriel Gomez. I was born in El Paso, Texas, and I grew up, born and raised, El Paso, Texas. So.
Okay. It's really interesting because I'm sure you're aware of this, having won the Latino Poetry Prize. That our first winner was also from El Paso, Texas.
Sure, yeah.
So it makes me wonder, what is it about El Paso that's producing these wonderful writers, people like yourself,
right.
Cheryl Luna, of course, Ray Gonzalez,
mm-hmm.
who's from El Paso, a fiction writer named Richard Yanez, who maybe you'll meet at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your beginnings as a writer and how you came into poetry, and it may have involved El Paso, Texas or not, but I'm just using
mm-hmm.
it as a springboard.
Sure. I think a big part of it was my parents were still very connected with Mexico, in the sense of they were not only from there, but we spent a great deal of time there in their hometowns. Specifically, my mom, there was a little town outside of Villomada named Carrizal, which is, I think, about 2 hours south of El Paso, over the border of Juarez. And having grown up there, part of the time I was educated in the States. I'm a citizen, but I attended school there. I lived in Juarez until I was 3. And so I guess that those two realities were I was very sensitive to those two worlds, in the sense of, I would come to the States, I would have a very sort of American life, if you will. And then I would go back to Mexico, and this was extremely rural. I think a phone was just hooked up, one main phone like 5 years ago. So it's a very, very rural farming community.
So how much time were you spending in each place?
I think about it this way. I was in school, I guess, 9 months out of the year, and so we would spend summers and holidays and all that kind of stuff the rest of the time there. And this was pretty much the case until I was about 12 to 13, and then it became less more as a teenager.
Was there anything about that experience because I can imagine someone having that experience and ending up being a doctor,
sure,
or another profession. There's something about that experience that...
The language, quite frankly, the English and the Spanish. I always, I instantly, or not instantly, it's sort of, I didn't compound it, but I was always attached to the musicality of the language. I was attached to the rhythms, to the meters of just the natural spoken word. And naturally through that, I was just exposed, obviously, through the music. I would listen to sort of rock music in El Paso or whatever, and then listen to norteñas and rancheras and all that kind of stuff in Mexico. So I was introduced to a kind of form of storytelling, to a form of formalized, language being put in a very sort of formal way to tell a story, that kind of stuff. So I was very attracted to those kind of rhythms, and so
I hear you talking about language. I hear you talking about music.
Yeah.
At any point during your education in those first 12, 13, 14 years, did an English class ever come into play?
No, it really didn't. I wasn't the biggest reader as a kid, and it was my parents both worked extremely hard, and so obviously education was like a big part of it. But sitting down with books or that kind of stuff wasn't the top priority. I mean, it really wasn't, and it's not a sort of an indictment against my folks, but really how my interest in poetry first came about was through music, clearly. I mean, it was my...
And you mentioned storytelling. Was there an element of, did you have older relatives?
Certainly my grandmother, and the quintessential sort of Mexican experience of cooking dinner together, cooking lunches, and we would all gather, and then we'd hang out, and friends from the community or whatever would come over, and then we'd spend these nights just talking and telling stories. So it became
This is really interesting
to
hear, because you'll see how this is related. I was just at a conference, an international conference in Chicago, and there's a Russian writer, and she was asked the question, were there books in your home when you were a child? And she said that for her, writing did not part from having texts around the house, but rather listening
Absolutely.
to her grandmother tell her stories.
Yeah,
and seemed to be mimicking
Well, the thing that's really interesting in the sense of, you know, I would it was just huge, vast playgrounds. I had friends, but I also there was these beautiful ejidos, these beautiful stretches of farmland where we could just go walk, and you're by yourself. And you know, when people, I mean, it's literally true that, you know, the siesta, the 2 o'clock after lunch, is so hot, and I wouldn't do that because I'm not, you know, I don't. I really rarely sleep during the day, and so while everyone was just kind of chilling out, I would go on these long walks and really absorb the heat and kind of just explore around. So I had this huge cache of memories, of language, of ideas until I was a teenager, until quite literally in high school when I sort of separated myself less from that. I started, you know, becoming more involved with my friends in El Paso and dating girls and that kind of noise. That it started to trickle out through poems.
Started to trickle out through poems. So are you suggesting then that maybe you began to explore this medium of writing words down before you encountered the first poem that sparked something?
Sure. I mean, frankly, I wasn't really moved by poetry until I was in college. I mean, when I read Wallace Stevens, you know, his Meditations, and or, you know, Theodore Retke, people like that, or Robert Haas. I mean, that was when my world completely sort of blew up. And I'd known of, you know, the writers, you know, especially people like Arturo Islas, and, you know, I knew of these people, and, you know, Gary Soto and stuff like that. But that wasn't in my worldview at the time. Yeah. You know, it was very much, you know.
Your introduction to poetry as an art form that opened up another world to you was through, you mentioned Stevens
and
Theodore Retke,
T.S. Eliot, Robert Haas. Robert Haas was probably the single most. When I read Meditations at Lagunitas, you know, it was over.
So how did you? Because he's a contemporary writer.
Yeah.
And I remember my high school English teacher was his student at St. Mary's College.
Sure.
This would have been like in the late 60s, early 70s. It's funny that you make that connection. So how did you come across? I mean, I came across Robert Haas through a high school teacher. How did you come across?
I came across Haas through. Well, I should sort of preface this as well. I took the way I really I found myself studying poetry as an art and something that I wanted to do was in high school. I took a creative writing class, and that. You know, again, these sort of little ideas started coming out, and then earlier when I was in, you know, like middle school and stuff, I would replace replace lyrics to Dylan and REM and stuff, because that's how really I learned how the rhythms of how language sort of formally, quote unquote, worked, was through these rock songs. So, you know, I took this class, and that was really the first formal time that I'd heard of, you know, Sestina, and, you know, again, the sonnets of Petrarcans and the shit, you know, all the nuts and bolts, and a strophe and an anti-strophe and all this kind of stuff. And it was really sort of like a foreign language to me. I didn't sort of gravitate towards it, but I still knew that if I put two words together, and then so not necessarily rhymed or whatever, but if I pieced them together in some way, that they had such a spark, that I just had such a visceral response to it. It was amazing.
Did your high school teacher introduce Haas into the syllabus?
Did not. Just mostly, again.
Yeah, who was on your high school syllabus?
Man, that is a fun question. I frankly don't remember. I mean, obviously, you know, we read a lot of, you know, all that kind of noise, which was fine. But again, I was still very much in my own world about. So
the writer who turned you on the most was someone you discovered outside the class.
Outside the class, it was.
And you don't remember how.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one of these things that I kind of, you know, in high school and these types of things, you know, in poetry classes and literature classes, you read obviously who you read. You read Coleridge, you read Milton, you read all these really wonderful writers. So I was certainly exposed to that through the high school curriculum, but there was really not a whole lot of exploration outside. You know, there was Marquez, of course, with, you know, I became very close friends with my librarian at school, because, you know, that at that point I was reading at high school just voraciously anything I could get my hands on. She would feed me all this stuff. She actually turned me on to Islas and a lot of other, you know, Alberto Rios and people like that. But really, truly, it wasn't until I saw or I read Haas in college as a freshman.
Do you remember encountering him in an anthology, or was it?
It was one of these vintage anthologies, and it had, I forget, it was like the green one. It's been around forever and ever and ever. And it was an introduction to contemporary poetry, and it was a course that I had taken with Greg Glazer, who was a poet.
Do you remember any of the other poets in that anthology who caught your attention?
Definitely Galway Kinnell. I think if we, the sort of foundation that really cemented it for me was Praised by Robert Haas, The Book of Nightmares by Galway Kinnell, C.K. Williams, various C.K. Williams poems, just the sort of the narratives about his coming up, and you know.
And these are writers you were encountering in college.
In college, definitely, you know, and people like Phil Levine. You know what? What's that poem called? The one that You Could Have It. Is that what it's called?
What Work Is.
What Work Is. Is that what it is?
He has a book called What Work Is.
Yeah, I think what it is. Anyway, it's Phil Levine, and then eventually, of course, when I discovered Wallace Stevens, and when I simultaneously, and I also at that time, but I gravitated towards Lorca and Neruda and Nicanor Parra and all those cats.
Did you take writing workshops in college?
I did.
How was that experience?
It was a good experience. I mean, for the most part, it was the idea of writing poetry and having your peers sort of talk about it.
Yeah.
Was totally foreign, for the most part. The creative writing workshop that I took was, you wrote poetry, and it wasn't really discussed as a thing in progress. Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really, it wasn't something that was just shaped. So when I took these workshops, I really recognized the process of the first instinctual idea to the finished product that could be years later, which I later discovered. So it gave me that sense of discipline and that idea of just keeping going.
Did a poet like Robert Haas and Galway Kinnell become models when you began writing your own poems?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
I'd like to use this moment to transition into a poem in the book, which I'm going to ask you to read, and it will serve as a springboard to some other questions that I have.
Sure.
And it's from the first section, and it's one of the poems that I enjoyed the most from the first section. And just ignore my markings and let us hear what this poem sounds like in your voice.
Sure. Okay. This is coined. Spoke in foam soliloquy to your pierceless ear. Waiting fog slept spooned with puzzled sea vine. Hear it now, brine copper light, a serpentine root. Wind's gravity maybe, a porous skin, stone jowl, bite, nay, awake, for rain on yellowed root. How random. On auger, shoulder floor milled after car breeze, Picasso's night fishing and at Thebes, non-native grass, quelled, now sleeps.
One of the things I noticed about when I first saw this poem was its interesting use of both punctuation and white space. And I guess my question is, with this particular poem, and maybe your work in general in this book, what your relationship is, what role you see in your own work for punctuation and white space.
One of the things about, I guess just sort of other punctuation grammar tools, if you will, is to really aid in, to help, the reader sort of read, sort of give that experience of sort of coming off the page. So for me, it was just having these little marks, these little moments where it somehow just came off the page, made you cognizant of your breathing, made you cognizant of what's going on in the poem, et cetera, et cetera. So with this specific poem, Coined, and I used the little comma to begin with a pause. I wanted the reader to sort of just, to give it like a pause before.
So it's almost like a stage direction.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Comma,
it's like a staging
the
almost.
The comma is a stage direction to almost take a breath before you.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that even in my own reading that I still find it, with even from ellipses to semicolons and things like that, and really using them in frankly a formal way, but I'm just kind of taking them out. I guess the result, I'm not too concerned with fragments and all these other things or dangling modifiers and et cetera, et cetera.
What about the white space? I mean, you do some pretty interesting things.
I'm a big fan of the painters, of the visual arts. and their use of space and the economy of kind of just placing objects in relation to other objects and really creating compositions on the page with the words is something that's just fascinated me.
Well, that's a good segue into a related question, because I couldn't help but notice that you reference Picasso in this poem.
Sure.
In another poem you reference Guernica.
Mm-hmm.
And I also got a sense that there are some of your poems are quite visual. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship to the visual arts and how that has influenced your writing?
I think in every way, in the sense of when I think about the biggest influences that I do have, my head is always falters towards kind of interdisciplinary means, frankly. People like Alexander Calder, Picasso, Paul Klee, the Bauhaus, even to like Walter Gropius, who's an architect. I've always gravitated to these artists and to see their, I see their work in sort of very poetic ways, and again these compositions of how they're of how they work with placement, they work with a relationship to the spectator, the viewer. They always have an intensity of engaging the audience, if you will.
Did your interest in the visual arts coincide with your interest in poetry?
Certainly, yeah.
And being very conscious of wanting to explore writing in an interdisciplinary way, were there models for you in that sense, as far as other poets?
I really didn't look for them, frankly, because I didn't know they were there until I found people like Lynn Haginian, Jack Spicer, Robert Duncan, these all the San Francisco dudes, yeah. And until I found that, and there was like this community of people in Scalapino and Ray Armentrout that just that held that idea.
So, if I hear you correctly, you seem to be saying that you sort of self-discovered this affinity for wanting to deploy words in a way that takes into account your attraction to the visual arts, and you're doing that sort of alone in the desert on your own, and then you discovered these other poets.
Community. And frankly, this is something that I discovered of other Latino poets working in kind of experimental forms. These are ideas that, to be quite honest with you, I don't consider myself experimental in the least. I consider myself just responding to the environment that I've witnessed, frankly. And the more I look around, especially with Junta and this publication, and frankly the last several years, really finding poets that are thinking in similar ways.
You said something really provocative, and you've said that you don't consider yourself an experimentalist, that you're responding to what you had around you. So was there something in that transnational childhood that made you open to wanting to pursue poetry in this interdisciplinary way?
What's interesting? When I went to Mexico, as a man,
yeah.
You go down there and there's no such thing as Latino literature. There's no such thing as Chicano literature. There's just literature. There's just words. There's just los poetas, whatever. And when I come here, it's all automatically, it's a whole new, it's politicized. It's 10,000 other things in the U.S. And it's interesting to me because I've always, in some way, I've always felt a real connection, but in some ways I've always felt this complete disparity from the Latino writer community, because it's like, well, it's like saying I'm eating one type of food, or I'm only experiencing this in one type of music. My worldview and the Latino world that I sort of grew up in is so complex, so absolutely complicated, that I'm just taking bits and pieces of it. So that to me isn't very experimental. It's just a world that I grew up in. And this is, and that's why El Paso is such an interesting place. It's a little tiny ribbon of water that separates these two vast, worlds. It's just, it's this sort of confluence of ideas of commercialism meeting, these.
Well, I think also in hearing you talk about the writers you mentioned, Jack Spicer, Robert Duncan, Lynn Haginian, Leslie Scalapino, these are all writers from California. When did you discover them? Because I don't put them in the same camp as Robert Hass at all.
Yeah.
In some ways.
Actually, Spicer was, that was really early on, and Duncan think because we're in the same sort of anthology, and when I discovered poetry, it was a really curious time. I became very intrigued by it, in the sense of, why doesn't this rhyme? Why isn't this a sonnet? Why isn't it talking about love and roses and all this kind of stuff? It's talking about, ideas of war and our placement in that, and the poets, almost this idea of like, this is who you're, this is what I'm looking at, and this is what our responsibility, et cetera, all this kind of stuff. So that sort of affinity, that kind of idea for people like Spicer, who I think was just kind of out there and kind of nutty, and Duncan and.
Were these writers discovered at college?
This, mostly in school, and then it really, I studied at St. Mary's College in Moraga, and that's where it just kind of blew up.
Well, did you have Brenda Hillman?
Brenda Hillman, yeah, and she opened.
What influence did she have, if any?
I knew who she was when I was applying to grad schools, and I knew that Bob had taught there and had a huge relationship in there with St. Mary's and stuff, and so.
But he had already.
He was already at Cal by that point.
Okay.
That I knew that the community and stuff, and I looked at some of the poets that had visited there. It's a fairly young program when I was there, so I think it was like 4 years old at most, and I knew that I wanted to be in San Francisco because I knew that sentiment was there. I knew that sort of that vitality that. So
did you have this sort of notion of, wow, the Cisco Renaissance took place over there, and I want to study writing in that area?
I knew the language poets were there, frankly. I knew Lynn Heginian was there. I knew that, I hadn't, I didn't know Michael Palmer there by that point, but I knew that the poets that, that were there, I knew of, like the beat poets and that kind of stuff. That really didn't turn me on at all. But I knew that there was something going on in my little sort of world of trying to sort of navigate through Stevens and all that, William Carlos Williams and that kind of stuff, and still really trying to find who I was as a poet and if I had anything interesting to say,
When you went out to the Bay Area, while you were there, did you discover any new writers who you weren't aware of before, in addition to the ones that you already knew?
Michael Palmer was probably. I found out about him through school.
So when you arrived at St. Mary's, you had not read his work yet?
No.
And had you heard of him?
Actually, no. Which was interesting because now because he's such a major figure, and frankly, such a major figure in my writing now. When I read his work, I was, I think it was Notes for Echo Lake, and that just blew my head off. I was like, what is this? And it was really incredible because, is it The Promises of Glass?
That sounds like it.
He was composing that while we were students.
Was he a visiting writer there?
He wasn't. He knew he was friends with Brenda, and I studied with Brenda, and I studied with Lynn Heginian, which was wonderful, with Joshua Clover. So and they were all friends, and
so it must have been a dream program for you.
It was incredible because it was in some ways it was a polar opposite of what Greg had been teaching us. And sort of and not so much in sort of these traditional, like staunchly traditional forms, but it's very, very different from what we're doing.
Here's a question for you, because I know this sometimes happens with a lot of writers.
Mm-hmm.
They encounter a writer that they read early in their trajectories. In your case, that might be Robert Hass,
mm-hmm.
or the Robert Hass of Praise and Galway Canal.
Sure.
And then as they begin to expand their reading horizons, they begin to reevaluate their relationship to that work that attracted them in the beginning.
Sure.
Has anything like that happened with Robert Hass?
No, not really. I still love his poetry. I don't love all of his poetry, but that book is still central to my
Praise.
Yeah.
What about the ones that came afterwards?
Not so much.
So you like
Praise is a book for. I mean that. Yeah, I mean that's the one. I don't know for what reason. It's the one that I connected most. It's something. It spoke to me and intellectually and viscerally, and I thought it was just a beautiful piece of writing. I mean, as a book, I thought it was tremendous.
And where do you put someone? Because you brought him up, and as I'm thinking about the writers we've been talking about in the
mm-hmm.
last minute or so, where do you place Philip Levine in all of that? Because he's completely in another.
He's like my weird Uncle Bob, who comes in and has poems. I found some of his. My guess is that his, and these are huge arguments against Levine, that that I'm sure you know about. Whether feigned or not, I felt the voice that he was, the sort of the working class kind of thing. I felt,
the narrative.
Yeah, the narrative sort of is something that I connected to, in the way that, frankly, I connected to, like, say, American blues music, because the norteñas and the rancheras. I just saw such a connection there, and sort of I found that I frankly don't love his work, but as a young guy, as a young poet, I felt that, wow, these are really sort of interesting
So has
poems.
your relationship to his work changed since you first?
Yeah, I really don't read them anymore. And that's not just, it's not a conscious thing. I just lost interest, really.
Okay, well, you mentioned blues, so I'm gonna ask you to read this poem.
Sure.
It's a three-part poem, but it's one of my favorite. Before we get to the meat of the
Sure.
book, which is the title poem, and I want you to read it, and then I want you to comment on your relationship in more explicit terms to music.
Sure.
Take your time.
Okay. This is Bluegrass. 1. Sound knots pinned to a fabricless body, form of oak bone, barreled chest, the presence of acoustic music over the instrument resting on your lap, a limited vehicle, but you knew that, having learned tablature, the guitar posed in sculpture, cleared its throat by reaching the oval-capped, flushed against the stomach into its curious sound. Gather fingers around an exhaustible voice and play the strings. 2. Bread-shaped a song as we ate and fidgeted, the pitch of river frozen to stillness, a film reeled and taut, swelling water oily in its cold, steps before it hardens, and utterance before song is shaped, a compression of freezing water eating away at its own babbling face. 3. Where are the boxes of clothes, of newspaper to scoop inside cups? Feel free to comment, miss nothing as if chewing a new food. These are features of comfort, a lower altitude. Move further, but no egg crate to snug the ends of the hutch. A chimera of tempered sand, speak of her house absolved by the wiping ocean, speak her name by way of mountains, the mirrors, silver flaking from the edges of the mirrors, leaving only glass, unreflective patches, the promised half, the unanswerable ruin of aperture, begging from where you haven't seen yourself in years.
What about music? What about music in your poetry?
It's something that spoke to me just very early on. Just the way, it wasn't so much the musicianship that came afterwards, but just the way I didn't see any difference between the musical note and the word. Does that make sense? The melody, the harmony, the pitch. I see that visually, words. So maybe that's frankly why I see it, like painting and color and sort of the balance of composition. All these things are just the same thing to me.
This poem, you wrote this poem because bluegrass happens to be a genre of music that you specialize in?
Bluegrass music is a folk music, obviously, and it's American folk music, and it's but in a lot of ways it embodies its influences come from Eastern Europe to these very sort of old blues and country sounds, and they come from all over the place to create this. It's all stringed instrumentation, but it's very percussive. It's very, very interesting music, very sort of complicated music, but it's just this rural folk music that has sort of very worldly, ends, if you will. I mean, it's all of these different things happening and firing at once to sort of create this music, which I find fascinating.
Has your work as a music journalist influenced your poetry?
I think so. I mean, a lot of the ways I'm exposed to more music that I know what to do with now. But I think still what attracted me to music in the first place, and sort of at the sort of knucklehead, sort of visceral end to it, to the sort of bigger things.
Describe for our viewers what your work in music journalism consists of.
Well, I'm a music critic. That's what I do, and it's mostly just rock and pop and all this kind of stuff. And I have a weekly column, and so I write. I go and review shows and review records, and just kind of tell.
How many words per column?
It's very short. It's 850 words.
Mm-hmm.
It's very sort of tight and compact. Every week, yeah.
So
But it's actually it's been good for me.
So this begs the question then.
Yeah.
Here are two very, what I would imagine are two very different types of writing, which is, you know, composing poems where you're not especially on a deadline,
Yeah.
and writing journalism where you are on a deadline. Is there any intersection between the two? Has writing the journalism affected the way you write poems?
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote this book took me 6 years to complete, and where I was happy with, and so it was. I mean, it's a long time, and parts of it appear in my graduate thesis. So it's kind of all over the place. And the new manuscript that I just completed took me 9 months. Yeah, Breach took 9 months. So, and I had an idea, and that's the thing about it, though, that was really interesting about the writing these two books. This was kind of it was a collection, and I knew that I was kind of walking all over the place. Of course, the Outer Bands really sort of formalized, this is what I'm going to write about. Frankly, when I wrote the Outer Bands, that was the first time I said, this is what I'm going to write about. When I wrote Breach, frankly, it's an extension of the Outer Bands. It took that idea.
Like a sequel.
It is a sequel,
and a sequel to the title poem.
And I'm calling it a triptych. I mean, there's a visual art again because I'm composing the third part of it now.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, because this is the idea that I was working through, and this is what I wanted to capture in this very, very specific time. So that's what Breach is about. So
This is a good leading to the next question, which is sort of related to Jack Spicer, because Jack Spicer talked about, you know, writing books.
Yeah.
The collected books of Jack Spicer, and but I'm going to just read this to you and ask you to respond. When I was reading the section 20 retablos,
Mm-hmm.
I was reminded of the haibun, the Japanese form that combines prose with verse. But also your use of the italic versus the non-italic forced me to consider and reflect upon how meaning might be influenced by something as material as the texture of a typeface. And I'm wondering if this is something you thought about, both when you were writing prose with verse,
Yeah.
and then italics versus non-italics.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about the genesis of that series and what you were trying to aim for?
Sure. It's this idea of this. I'm sure I had. This is there's another term for it, but it's sort of multivocality. I was keeping in mind this idea of choruses in the sense of like Greek theater chorus, having two conversations happening at once, and one is sort of this idea of exposition, and the other idea is sort of responding to it. So there's several things happening at once with 20 retablos, and specifically with the Outer Bands, in that I want, there's, the sort of the figurative and the sort of the literal in two instances, and two very different experiences. One is obviously taken from, like, say, for instance, the Outer Bands, the newspaper headlines. This is it's direct language. It's
Found language?
What's that?
Found language?
Found language, direct language, and it has a very, very specific purpose, and that it is to inform and sort of, but at the same time, I was fascinated by, sometimes they would use, they would be all caps for, to accent to have the emotive quality to it. And to me, as far as syntax and, again, punctuation and some of the things that, some of the things that are italicized, some things that are not italicized, to me, the sort of the emotive effect of having that on the page is something that I've always sort of kind of tooled around with, and that's specifically with the retablos.
So would it be fair to say that perhaps the experience of composing retablos was like a study for the Outer
Yeah,
Bands?
certainly. Retablos was something that, I'm fascinated by these little retablos, the little, carving the saints or whatever. And to me, the idea of, you're carving these little saints, you're carving these little idols, and then you take, this sort of this a world that's sort of informed, that's in this tight little package, and you just take it places, and you take time. It's almost a form of idolatry, if you will, if this idea of just creating these little tiny spaces of just ideas, of worldviews.
Did the form come first before you thought of a name for it, or did you think retablos and then you wrote the series?
I started hammering out the language first, and that's how I just write. It starts with words. It starts with, these two words sound fascinating to me, or like something. The title of my next book is called Egress, So which is something that I heard the word, obviously knew what it meant. I said that is the idea that I'm going to write under, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So and that's in a book sense. In a poem sense, that's kind of the way it works as well.
Talking to you now, I'm getting a sense that you seem to be interested in how two discourses can coexist on
Sure.
the same page.
Yeah.
It leads me to also reflect on the fact that the book is made up of poems that are written in prose and poems that are written in lines, and sometimes a mixture of the two. I'm sure this is a question that poets get asked a lot, especially those who do both, and that is, what is your process? How do you arrive at the form that the poem is going to take, whether it's going to be in prose or in lines?
I never think about it, frankly. My students will probably have a heart attack, but actually, it's something I let the idea hammer it out, and sort of like, say for instance, I have.
Well, let's look at
Sure.
think of a poem in particular, like you have here figurines and
Curriculum similar to
and
that.
curriculum.
Yeah.
Did those just come out in prose and they stayed in prose?
Yeah, they stayed. They never moved.
Okay. Have you had the experience of the opposite happening? Another way, have you had the experience of writing something out in a block of prose and then trying it out in lines?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
Maybe, maybe it works better in lines than.
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
others.
I mean, those two specific, actually, Figurines was a poem that was left out for some reason. That I decided to leave it out, but then I just at the last minute sort of chucked it in there. But yeah, I felt that at least curriculum to me, because this was at a point that I was also teaching, my first teaching job and that kind of stuff, and I felt that it was almost like. I felt that it was like a thesis statement of some kind, like a lead in a newspaper. I felt that it was a paragraph to a much larger idea. So within that, I felt it was kind of, it was kind of like an introduction to, like an essay almost, if you will. I just took it from that. I mean, it was really, yeah. But I mean, frankly, a lot of the other ones, I don't think about. I try to let the idea see, like, well, how is this going to be told? Yeah, how can this be? How is this going to be shaped?
Is there a different energy you're experiencing when you're writing a poem in prose as opposed to lines?
Sure. I mean,
I'm not even sure I would answer that, but I'm just throwing it out.
Sure. I guess there is. But like I said, it sort of just depends on what's how many cylinders are firing at the time.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about two things. One, because this is an oral history.
Sure.
Tell us about where you were and what happened when Hurricane Katrina took place, and tell us about the genesis of this title poem.
Sure. I was. It was interesting, and we evacuated on the Saturday prior to the storm. The storm hit on Sunday night, Monday morning, and so we evacuated to Lafayette, Louisiana. And the only, obviously, it made landfall in Waveland, Mississippi. And the levees broke and they flooded and destroyed my home and all this kind of stuff. And so we were very much at the mercy of, that. We didn't know what was happening, if we had jobs, what happened to our house. It was an incredibly stressful time.
So first you were able to get out.
We got out. We got out and we sort of witnessed the storm like everybody else in the free world, just kind of looking at this on television. At my in-laws in Lafayette, Louisiana, which is roughly 120 some odd miles east of New Orleans. And when we were there, we only had the kind of residual effects of the storm, meaning that we had the outer bands sort of just rained on us, and sort of there's the eye of the storm. And then the outer bands are the ones that cause the most damage, that bring the rain and the wind and this spiral. So we had we had a lot of rain and wind and stuff, but that's the majority of it. And then 4 days after that, we were driving to my parents' house in El Paso. We stopped by outside of Dallas. We took a detour to see one of Julie's uncles in Albany, Texas. And I received an email from Maria about Momotomo Press saying, "Hey, sorry this happened. We want to publish your book." So it was really bad timing. Which was wonderful because you guys had the manuscript for a long time. It was totally unsolicited. It was crazy. But amid all that, saying like, now we want to publish your book was insane. So we went to El Paso, try to rearrange our lives and try to find out what's happening.
The Outer Bands as the
it
title
didn't
of the book
exist.
doesn't exist.
The title of the book was Sanctuary.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, that's right.
Yeah, and so we go to El Paso, and we go up to see some friends in Santa Fe, and find out that the Santa Fe Art Institute, gave emergency relief residencies. And I said, look, I just found out this news, and I need to, because I was corresponding a lot with Maria, and she was like saying, well, editing and all this kind of stuff. And I said, I need to get focused on this and to do it. And so they gave me a 2-month residency, and Julie returned to Lafayette and to Covington to sort of deal with her work and that kind of stuff. And I was put on hold with my work teaching at the university. So for 2 months, I was there editing Sanctuary. And in the meantime, just this hurricane, man. You're just like, it's October, it's 2005, and your home has been destroyed. It's horrible.
And you began noticing these headlines.
Okay. So my mother-in-law, actually, we'd gone back to, they finally let us into the city. We cleaned out our house. It flooded. It was horrible just getting our stuff and putting it in storage, and it was just a bad scene. So I returned to Santa Fe to do my residency to finish this thing up. And so my mother-in-law had kept the New York Times from Hurricane Katrina to Hurricane Rita. She kept them all. So I said, I want to have them because I was very, at Tulane, where I was teaching at the time as well, I taught a media course on propaganda and all this kind of stuff. So I was very interested in what the story was, and so I decided to use the New York Times as a sort of, like, what are they saying? So I had these headlines, and I decided to write all these headlines down and sort of respond to, like, this is what is happening. This is according to them, and this is according to me, because I wanted to write like a kind of almost like a journal, but I wanted to capture that moment, that desperation, and those ideas from those 2 days, from those 2 hurricanes, as vividly as possible.
So that's how you came up with the device of headline and then a response.
Headline and the response, and then the postscript, and what, this idea that I had from 20 Retablos.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's how I'll approach it.
When you embarked on this project,
mm-hmm.
did you ask yourself if there were any other models of writers who had done something similar?
No, not really.
How about since then?
No, not really. I haven't really looked, frankly. It's just, but that's what the project, that's what I wanted to do, and use the model of, like, how am I going to do this call and response. And frankly, it was just kind of a quick thing. It wasn't that I labored over the idea, just that I kept those headlines. And I wanted to stare at those headlines, frankly, for very personal reasons, because this is very much it was happening.
Well, as Valerie says in your introduction, you have the headline, and then sometimes you have the speaker tells the reader what's happening at the exact same time. Like, I was struck by the one where the speaker is at the Sears Tower. At the Sears Tower, 2 young Amish couples wait with us in the lobby as it fills steadily, and then the headline is the Superdome at Stadium. A haven quickly becomes an ordeal. Yeah. So even though you do have this call and response, they're doing different things.
Yeah.
They're doing different things.
So I wanted to capture it, but I was aware that that I wanted to create the poetry from it. I wanted to create poems from this experience, and I wanted to create them as almost as it was happening, as a form of reportage, if you will, something. And so it was a very sort of conscious effort, how they're composed, how they look on the page, how even from, the logical fallacies that I use, like all of these different elements is something that, this is, in a lot of ways, this is a poem that I've sort of been waiting to write. All of my ideas about, from this writer or that writer, the prose and, the line and the lyric and all this kind of stuff, I put it in there.
What role do you see, certainly for me one of the most political poems in the book is the one with these Bush pledges federal role in rebuilding Gulf Coast.
Yes.
Do you see politics? Does politics have a role in any of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. You exist in the world, so that's just the way I see it. You know, it's just like if you're really present in the world that you live in, then be present in the world that you live in. This is what was in here. And so what I didn't want to do is have this really sort of, and I try to, and this is something that was really difficult. Not, you know, don't experience this vicariously. You're living it. This is you. You're not there right now, but this is something that affects you just completely, totally directly. You know, so that was a struggle. I mean, as an artist and, you know, as just a person, but yeah.
I want to wind this down by reading a quote from the press release for an event we just organized,
Mm-hmm.
and then ask you to comment on it and share with our readers, with our viewers, what work you're doing presently in trying to, what I view as reconfigure the conversation around Latino poetry
Sure.
and Latino poetics. I'm assuming you were responsible for this language, but you can correct me if you say, or the press release for the event that you created says, Latino writers have historically embraced experimentation of form and craft as a way to explore their culture. Interestingly, the majority of Latino writing published in the United States is often formulaic and derivative of a well-defined and accepted Latino experience. Rarely, if ever, does the writing express the immense diversity of philosophies and aesthetics practiced by artists in the Latino community. In short, the notion of an American Latino avant-garde is virtually non-existent. So could you comment on
Mm-hmm.
what the context from which such a statement arose,
Sure.
and what you see as your role in this?
Sure. Like I said, it's you know, it's one thing to consider yourself, I'm an experimentalist, I'm an avant-gardist, and like I said, I don't necessarily consider myself to be like this truly sort of experimental sort of poet. But when I you know, this book was published, and this entire community was open to me. You know, people like Peter Ramos and Rosa Cala and these incredible writers, who I felt were writing in sort of similar ways.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that you know, historically, it's in a historical sense, it seemed like this a real movement of sort of the avant-garde. Obviously, these poets, you know, they've published widely. You know, they've won awards and these types of things. So you know, they've been recognized. But as a whole, you know, I started to think about, well, is the complexity of their ideas, of their aesthetic, and their this panoramic worldview of their work in the Latino community, you know, with other writers and stuff, is that really evident? So,
I mean, if you were to look at language poetry anthologies,
how many Latinos are there?
you don't really see.
You don't see them.
So,
And so, and compounded by the fact that you have, you know, like, new American writing and this and that and this and that, and you know, consistently, you don't see, you know, Latino voices are kind of, you know, not there. When you know, I'm aware that there are plenty of writers out there. So
what are you aiming to do then with the anthology?
I really want to champion this idea of there are writers that are not only very exciting, you know, they're producing just very exciting work, but also have as much to say in shaping the face of American poetry. And I think that's absolutely key.
And where does Latino poetry come into that discourse? See it as expanding the
Absolutely, and I think it's something that, you know, this is something that, you know, not to sort of be reductive about it, but looking towards our community about what's happening in literature in America.
Yeah.
You know, because we have again, our community, our Latino community, is it's vast, and I think the complexity of that, the aesthetic of that, is not really well represented.
Even within Latino discourse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think ultimately, I just really want to promote this style of work. And I hate to even say style of work, but, you know, I really want to promote Latino writers who are just doing crazy good stuff, you know, because at the end of the day, it's just about the work, and it's about, you know.
What's the title of the anthology again?
Currently, it's still Junta.
Is there a subtitle?
I think it's Junta, the Innovative Voice and Innovation in the Latino Voice, is the current working title.
And how has winning the prize affected you? What is the prize meant? What has the prize meant as far as your writing, or what has your life changed at all since winning the prize?
I think so, and I think the best way is that I've met all these other writers that sort of think about similar ideas. You know, it's funny because this is you know, we're writers. We're writers by birth, but we're Latino by the grace of God. You know what I'm saying? That we're artists. That we at first and foremost, that the thing that connects us is a culture, it's a heritage, and it's something that we've adopted. And I think we're doing great things with. But I think at the same time that we have as much to say about the culture that we live in, that we create it, and that we're sort of been placed in charge of it in some way. And for me to sort of be at this, I'm using this this opportunity to really applaud the work of other writers that are just creating just some of the most tremendous work. And in my opinion,
you're sort of viewing yourself now as you move forward as in a position where you might be able to help other writers.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because it's. I think we should all do that.
I'd like to end by having you read a short lyric.
Sure.
Called Paper.
Oh. Paper. A wind rifles through the milk thistle, endemic with path, moves indiscriminately, turns a furious knot of kinky hair to something more alive and unclean, but in the kindest moment exposes leaf.
Thank you, Gabe.
Thank you.